Duke of Aldermere did not stand when she did. He stayed in the churchwarden's chair with his gloves across his knee, and he said it to the vestry without looking at her, "Leave physic to the college men." And the whole room breathed out in that soft laugh that is worse than a loud one. And Honora Meridew went on standing with her father's daybook held flat against her chest until the laughter had finished with her and there was nowhere left to stand. Then she sat down. The vestry room at Netherwend smelled of damp hassocks and candle smoke and the wet dogs 2 farmers had brought in out of the sleet. It was the 3rd week of December, and outside the churchyard was a gray soup, and the graves her father had dug the register for 2 winters ago were under snow that had turned the color of ash. Old Silas Threlkeld, the sexton, sat by the door with his hat on his knee, and he had laughed too. Not loudly, but he had. 6 weeks later, on the 2nd of February, that same Duke would stand in the snow outside her Physic garden with his hat in his bare hands and ask her for 2 things, and she would give him the first before he had finished asking, and the second would take him until the candles guttered. But that was Candlemas, and this was Advent, and in Advent the room was full and warm and certain of itself, and she was the only person in it who had buried, in ink, every soul the smallpox had taken in 3 parishes for 30 years, and knew to the day how each one had died, and knew, though she had never once said it out loud, exactly who had let it in. The vestry had been called to decide one thing. The pox was in Salterton, 11 miles off. It had come off a fair or a droving road, as it always came, and it had killed a wheelwright and 2 children in a fortnight, and Salterton was on the London road, and the London road ran through Netherwend, and everybody in the room knew what that meant, because everybody in the room over the age of 40 remembered 1808. So the question was not whether to do something. The question was what. And the Duke of Aldermere had already answered it, before Honora ever got to her feet, by announcing that he had written to London and engaged Dr. Josiah Kellow of Hanover Square to come down and inoculate the whole estate and the village against the smallpox before the Candlemas hiring fair, at his own charge, every man, woman, and child that would sit still for it, so that when the fair brought its 400 strangers up the down there, would not be a living soul in Netherwend the pox could catch. The room had liked that. The room liked a duke who paid. Men who had watched their own children buried in a bad winter liked being told, by a man with a carriage, that this winter would be different, and that it would cost them nothing, and that a famous doctor from Hanover Square would do it with clean instruments and a fee somebody else had already settled. It was the kindest thing a landlord had offered Netherwend in living memory, and it was going to kill people, and Honora Meridew was the only person in the room who could prove it. She was 24. She had come in at the back with snow to her knees, because the shop had a sick child in the back room, and she had stayed with it until the fever broke, and then walked the half-mile to the church in the dark. She had her father's daybook under her cloak to keep the wet off it, a fat brown leather thing with a cracked spine and a leather thong wound twice round it, and inside it, in 2 hands, her father's and her own, was every case of the smallpox and every case of the cowpox that had come to the Meridew shop, or been carried to it, or died within a walk of it since the year 1779, 31 years. Her father had begun it as a young man because his own master had told him a physician who does not write it down is only a rumor with a mortar, and Nathaniel Meridew had written it all down, every pustule and every pulse and every death, and had taught his daughter to hold the pen and read it back to him twice, always twice, because a thing read once might be a slip of the eye. She had held the shop alone since he died of the winter fever the January before last. She had waded through the whole of the Duke's speech. Then she had stood up, and the Duke had said his sentence. And that was that. What she had wanted to say, and had got about 9 words of before the laugh took her legs out from under her, was this, that there are 2 ways to arm a body against the smallpox, and they are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the difference between a burial and a birthday. The old way, the fashionable way, the Hanover Square way, was inoculation, variolation. The doctors called it now, to make it sound like Latin instead of what it was, and what it was this. You took matter from a living smallpox sore, from a real case, and you cut it into the arm of a well person, and you gave them the smallpox on purpose, a small dose, in the hope it would be a mild bout and leave them safe ever after. And for most it was mild. That was the trouble. That was the whole and entire trouble. For most it was a light case, and a fortnight in bed, and a few marks, and then a life. But a person inoculated with the true smallpox has the true smallpox, mild or not, and for the 10 or 12 days it runs in them, they are as full of it and as catching as any dying wretch in a pest house. And every soul they breathe on, who has not been armed, can take it in the natural way, in the deadly way, the way that killed 1 in 6 and blinded and pitted the rest. You did not inoculate a village to protect it from the pox. You inoculated a village and prayed the pox you had just planted in 40 arms, stayed politely in those 40 arms, and did not walk out the door on a child's breath and go looking for the unarmed. And in 1808, it had not stayed politely anywhere. There was the other way. There was the new way. The way the London men still sniffed at because a country doctor in Gloucestershire had found it and not a fellow of the college, and it was this, that the dairy people, the milkmaids and the cowmen who took the cowpox on their hands from the beasts, a nothing illness, a few sores on the wrist, a day of feeling poorly, those people never took the smallpox afterward. Never. Nathaniel Meridew had known it before the Gloucestershire man ever published, because it was in his book, in his own hand, 30 years of it. Tamsin Poole's mother, who had the cowpox as a girl and nursed her own 3 children through the smallpox in 1791 and never sickened. The whole Cold Harbor dairy through 2 outbreaks, untouched, while the families around them were carried out on doors. And the new inoculation, the vaccination, took the matter not from a smallpox sore but from a cowpox sore, from a milkmaid's wrist, and cut that into the arm, and it gave you the harmless cow illness, a sore and a day of aching, and it armed you against the smallpox exactly as well. And here was the whole of it. Here was the thing the room needed and did not hear. A person vaccinated with the cowpox could not give the smallpox to a soul, because they did not have it. You could vaccinate every child in Netherwend on the same morning and send them all home to their unarmed grandmothers, and nothing would happen but a week of sore arms. It was the safe door and the deadly door, and the Duke of Aldermere, out of pure open-handed kindness, at his own charge, had just engaged a famous man to march the whole parish through the deadly one, 6 weeks before he gathered 400 strangers on the down. Honora went home the long way, along the lane under the yews, because the churchyard path had a drift across it. The shop stood at the end of the village, where the street gave out onto the down, a low flint and brick place with the Physic garden behind it under snow, and the painted board over the door, Meridew, apothecary, that her father had let go gray on purpose because he said a bright sign was a boast. Inside there was 1 room down for the shop and the dispensing, the drawers of simples up the wall, the great scarred counter, the mortar the size of a font, and 1 room up where she slept, and the little back room with the fire where the sick child of a carter's wife was breathing easier now and would go home in the morning. She banked the fire and dried her hands and lit a candle and got the daybook down and opened it. Not at the front, but at the year 1808, where a folded paper lived that she used as a marker. She had used it as a marker for 2 years because it was stiff and the right size, and she could not bear to keep it anywhere she would have to look at it on purpose. It was a single sheet in Mr. Ambrose Sedgwick's small vestry hand, and it was a copy he had made her, the winter her father was dying and asked for it, of 1 page of the parish burial register. She had read it once, on the day it was given her, and folded it, and not read it since. Her father had asked for it because he was building the case even as the fever was building in him, and the last clear thing he ever said to her before the 2 days of wandering that came at the end was, "It's all in the dates, Honora. It was never anything but the dates. Read it twice, and don't be kind about it." She had been kind about it. That was the thing she had to sit with that December night, with the carter's child asleep in the back and the snow coming down past the window. For 2 years she had been kind about it, because the woman it would hurt worst was in the ground and could not be helped, and the man it would hurt next was a duke in a grand cold house who had lost his wife and shut himself up with a small son and a great grief. And there had seemed no profit and no mercy in walking up to a widower and telling him that the doctor he had trusted had killed the Duchess. But now the Duke had engaged another doctor to do the very same thing to the whole of Netherwend, and kindness had run out of road. So she wrote 3 letters in 8 days. The first she wrote plainly, and it cost her 4 hours and the better part of 2 candles. She wrote to the Duke direct, and she said without heat that there were 2 forms of inoculation, that the form Dr. Kello practiced gave the true smallpox and could seed an outbreak in the unarmed, that she had a record, kept 30 years, of every case in the district, that the cowpox method gave no such danger and armed the body as surely, and that she would be glad to show His Grace the book, and the dairy, and the proof, on any day he cared to name, before he brought a live pox into his village 6 weeks before the fair. She signed it with her name and her father's trade. The steward answered it, not the Duke. Mr. Pardew wrote 6 lines. His Grace was sensible of Miss Meridew's concern for the parish. His Grace had engaged Dr. Kello, whose standing in the profession was beyond question and required no support from any quarter. The College of Physicians was aware of the several methods, and Dr. Kello would no doubt employ that which his judgment approved. His Grace begged Miss Meridew not to alarm the cottagers, who were nervous enough of the operation without a druggist's daughter spreading tales of it. She read that last line 11 times, standing up, with her cloak still on and the snow melting off it onto the floor. A druggist's daughter spreading tales. The second letter was to Dr. Josiah Kello himself, at the Angel in Salterton, where the coach had set him down, and she kept a copy of it, and it was shorter, and it was, she thought afterward, the most useful thing she did that whole month, though it did not feel useful at the time. The third letter she wrote at midnight and burned at 12:30, because there was nothing in it but the dates and her grief and Nathaniel Meridew's daughter telling a duke he had let a doctor kill his wife. And grief is not evidence, and a burned letter has never yet lost anyone an argument. So she stopped writing letters and went back to work, because the pox did not care what a steward thought of her, and the pox was 11 miles off and coming. She rode out to Cold Harbor the next dry morning to see Tamsin Poole, who was 22 and milked at the dairy and had, on the back of her right wrist, a thing that mattered more than anything in the Duke's grand house. A fresh cowpox sore, blue-pearled, come up 9 days ago off a heifer with sore teats, doing exactly what God and Gloucestershire meant it to do. Honora looked at it the way another woman might look at a jewel, because it was the whole of her armory, because from that one milkmaid's wrist, if she was let, she could arm 40 people, and from their arms 40 more. She marked the day in the book. She told Tamsin to keep it clean and covered, and to send word the moment it began to dry, because a cowpox sore is only good for a few days at its ripeness, and she would need it ripe. And she rode home along the top of the down, with the whole county gray and white below her, and the numbers going round. And she understood, somewhere on that ride, that she was not going to be able to do this quietly, and that the only person in the parish who could open the door she needed opened was the one man who had told a room full of his own tenants to leave Physic to the college men. He came to her before she had worked out how to go to him. He came on the 4th of January, alone, at dusk, which surprised her more than the coming did. She was in the shop with the shutters half up, grinding, and she heard the horse, and she did not stop grinding, because the mixture was for a woman in labor up the lane and it wanted finishing. So what the Duke of Aldermere saw when he ducked under her lintel was the back of a young woman in a herb-stained apron who did not turn round for a duke. He waited. That was the first surprising thing about him. "Miss Merridew," he said at last. "You've a customer," she said, without turning, and tipped the powder into a paper and folded it in the 4 folds her father had taught her, and only then wiped her hands and turned round. He was younger up close than he had seemed across the vestry, 31 perhaps, tall, black-haired, clean-shaven, in a caped greatcoat still wet at the shoulders, and there was gray worn into the skin under his eyes that no man of 31 should have had, and he was holding, in both hands, the letter she had sent him and the copy of her letter to Kello, which meant the steward had passed them up after all. "Dr. Kello has written to me," he said, "about you. Has he? He says," and here the Duke looked down at the paper as though he did not quite believe he was going to say it, "that the druggist's daughter is right, and that if I let him inoculate this parish in the old way with the pox 11 miles off, I shall very likely bury more of my people than I save, and that he will not do it, and that I should send for the cowpox and the young woman who understands it." Honora stood very still. She had written to Kello expecting a London sneer, and had got, instead, a London gentleman honest enough to be embarrassed, and she had not dared hope it would carry. "Then send for them," she said. "That is what I have come to do," said the Duke. "I have come to ask you to arm my village. And before that tonight, I have come to ask you why, in your letter to a man you had never met, you were willing to say the method was dangerous, and in your letter to me you were not willing to say why you were so very sure." She had known the question was coming from the moment she saw the burial copy in his hand. It was not in his hand. He did not know it existed. But he was not a stupid man, and the not stupid ones always find the shape of the thing you have not told them. "Sit down, Your Grace," she said. He sat on the stool by the counter, a duke on an apothecary's stool with his ruined boots in the rushes, and she got the day book down and did not open it yet. "You want to know how I am so sure," she said. "I am so sure because I have 30 years of it written down, and because I have watched it, and because my father watched it before me. But that is how I know the cowpox is safe. That is not why I wrote danger to Dr. Kello. I wrote danger to Dr. Kello because I have seen the other thing happen. Here, in this parish. In 1808. He went still in the particular way a man goes still when you have walked, without knowing it, up to the edge of the thing he does not speak of. Go on, he said, and she found that now it was in front of her she could not do it with a flourish, so she did it the way her father would have, plainly in order from the book. In the autumn of 1808, she said, there was pox in the county, as there is now, and a doctor was engaged to inoculate against it, as one has been now. Not Dr. Kello, a Dr. Prynne, who is dead these 2 years. He inoculated in the old way, with the smallpox, because it was all he knew and all anyone here knew, and he did it well and cleanly by his own lights. And on the 4th of November he inoculated 11 people at the great house and in the village. She opened the book, at last, at the marker, and she did not take the marker out. It is here, in my father's hand, the 4th of November, 11 inoculated, and the names. Servants, mostly, a groom. 2 housemaids. The undercook's boy. She turned 2 leaves. And it took, in all of them, mild, as it mostly does, a sore arm and a fortnight, no deaths, and Dr. Prynne went away well satisfied and was paid. But an inoculated person is a catching person for 10 days or a fortnight. Your Grace, whether he feels ill or not, and one of those housemaids had a sister in the laundry who had never been armed against anything in her life, and the sister sickened on the 23rd of November in the natural way, badly, and she was the first. She turned another leaf, and her finger came down on a line, and from her it went the natural way through the unarmed, which is the deadly way, and my father wrote them down as they came, because that is what the book is for. She did not read the next name aloud. She turned the book round on the counter so that it faced him, and she put her finger under a line dated the 19th of December 1808, and she took her hand away and let him read it himself. He read it. She watched him read it. Her Grace, the Duchess of Aldermere, taken with the confluent smallpox, and under it, 4 days on, the second entry that finished the line, and he read that too, and the shop was very quiet, and out in the lane the snow had started again. Cassandra, he said once, and then did not say anything else for a while. Honora Meridew, who had rehearsed no speech for this because she had never truly believed she would have to give it, did the only merciful thing she could think of, which was to say the true thing. She did not die of God's will, Your Grace, she said. She did not die because it was her time, or because the winter was hard, or because the pox is a thing that happens to us like weather. She died because a well-meaning man cut a living pox into 11 arms to keep the parish safe, and it walked out of one of them, and it found the people who had not been armed, and she was nursing in the cottages that December, as you know, because I have heard it said everywhere that she was the kind of duchess who nursed in the cottages. She caught it doing a kindness, from a chain that started with another kindness. That is what I did not want to write to a widower in a letter. And that is what I am telling you now, in your own person, because in 3 weeks you are going to pay a great deal of money to do it again. He sat with the book turned toward him for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had gone very level, the way a voice does when a man has taken hold of it deliberately. You have known this for 2 years. I have known it for 2 years. And said nothing. There was no one it would have helped, she said. She was gone. You had a small boy and a house full of grief, and I was the druggist's daughter. And if I had come up your drive and said your doctor killed your wife, you would have shown me the door, and been right to, because I would have had nothing to offer you but a wound. It only becomes worth the wound, she said, now that you are about to do it to everyone else. He put his hand flat on the page, over the line, the way she had seen men touch a headstone, and then he took it away. "Read me the rest of it," he said. "Not the deaths, the cowpox, the safe part. Teach me the difference, from the beginning in your father's hand, and God help me if there is a college man in England who can tell me I ought to have learned it sooner." So she taught him. She stood behind her own counter with the candle between them and taught the Duke of Aldermere the whole of it out of a dead apothecary's book. The dairy families who took the cowpox and were never touched. The year the pox went through the village and around the Cold Harbor milkers like water round a stone, the Gloucestershire doctor and his milkmaid and his gardener's boy. And then the difference, said plainly and twice, because a thing said once is only a rumor, that the old inoculation gives the true pox and can spread it, and the new gives the cow's pox and cannot, and that a village armed the new way is a village you may gather in one room without fear, and a village armed the old way 6 weeks before a fair is a fuse. He did not go until near midnight, and at the door, with his hat on and the snow coming past the lamp, he said the thing that told her he had understood it all the way down. "I stood up in that vestry," he said, "and told these people to leave physic to the college men. And the college men killed my wife. And a druggist's daughter has kept the proof of it in a bookmark for 2 years so as not to break my heart with it. I owe you an apology I do not know how to make the size of, and I have not time to make it, because you tell me your milkmaid's wrist is only good a few more days." "It is," said Honora. "Then we begin tomorrow," said the Duke, "and you will tell me what you need, and it will be got." Now you would think that settled it. It did not settle it. That is the part nobody tells you. Because the Duke was one man, and he was converted, and one converted Duke is worth a very great deal. But the pox does not negotiate with dukes, and neither, it turned out, did the parish. They began the next morning at Cold Harbor, and Honora took the ripe lymph from Tamsin Poole's wrist onto a clean lancet, the way her father had shown her on a Gloucestershire pamphlet years before. And she vaccinated the dairy first, the willing, the ones who half understood it, and then the Duke's own household, because he insisted on being first among them himself, and rolled up his sleeve at his own kitchen table in front of his servants, and let a druggist's daughter cut cowpox into a ducal arm, which did more to quiet the servants' hall than any speech could have. But the village was another thing. The village had been told for a month that a famous man from Hanover Square was coming to make them safe, and now the famous man had gone home again, and instead there was Nathaniel Meridew's girl with a milkmaid's sore and a story about cows, and the same people who would have bared their arms to a stranger in a good coat folded them and stepped back from a woman they had watched grow up. Eli Broadmead, the head shepherd, 60 years old, who had a wife and a daughter and 3 grandchildren under his roof at the fold, stood in his own doorway and said he'd not have his family given a beast's disease on the word of a maid who sold worm powders, and half the down took its lead from Eli Broadmead. And the Duke could command his servants and could not command his tenants, not in their own bodies, not in England, and both of them knew it. So Honora did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to keep the book and show the book and go house to house with it in the cold, and to arm every soul who would let her, one wrist at a time, and to pray the pox stayed in Salterton the extra week she needed. It did not stay in Salterton. It came on the 17th of January, up the London road, in the person of a discharged soldier walking home to Dorset, who got as far as the Bell at Netherwend and could get no further, because the fever was on him and the first sores were up on his face, and the potman knew what he was looking at, and would not go near him. And within an hour, the whole village knew that the smallpox was sleeping at the bell. And that was the night the 4 months of walking in the sleet with the numbers going round became a thing with hands. Because a case in an inn on the London road with a hiring fare a fortnight off is not a tragedy yet. It is a fork in the road. And which way it goes depends entirely on what is done in the next 2 days by whoever is not too frightened to do it. Honora went to the bell in the dark with her lantern and her lancet, and Tamsin Poole's fresh matter carried warm against her. And she did the hard cold thing first. She had the soldier moved to the old pest hut on the down that had stood empty since 1808, and she found 2 men who had had the pox and lived, and so could not take it again, to carry him and to nurse him. And she paid them out of the Duke's purse because he had told her the purse was hers to spend, and she spent it. And then she began to draw the ring. She knew where the soldier had been, the tap room, the yard, the stable, and she knew who had breathed his air in the hours before the potman knew, and she went to every one of those houses that same night and the next day and vaccinated everyone in them and everyone next to them. Because a body vaccinated even a day or 2 after it meets the pox can still win the race. The cowpox being quicker into the blood than the smallpox is deadly. And every arm she armed was a door she shut in the pox's face. The Duke came out with her the second night, because she had run out of hands and would not run out of lymph, while there was a wrist and a lancet left in the parish, and he held the lantern and steadied the frightened, and wrote the names in the book as she called them. A duke doing a clerk's work in a laborer's kitchen at 1 in the morning, and by the 3rd house even the folded armed had begun to think that a thing a duke would leave his warm bed to do at midnight might be worth bearing an arm for. She taught 2 women that week to hold the lancet and take the matter clean from an arm that had taken well 6 days before, arm to arm, the way the Gloucestershire pamphlet showed, so that she would not be tethered forever to one milkmaid's single wrist. And by the end of it she had a little chain of them, 6 and 8 days apart, a ripe sore always somewhere in the parish to draw from, which is the whole secret of arming a village and not a household, and which no famous man in Hanover Square had ever once had to work out in the cold with his own frozen fingers. She did not sleep on the 17th. She did not sleep much on the 18th. And on the morning of the 19th, Eli Broadmead came down off the fold to the shop with his hat in his hands, which he had not taken off to anybody since his own wife's churching, and he stood in her doorway, and he was 60 years old, and his voice was not steady. "Miss Merridew," he said, "my grandson was at the bell Sunday, fetching the cart. He was in the yard with the man, near as I can tell, the soldier, and I didn't know it till this morning, and I laughed at you. In your own doorway I as good as called you a fraud. And now I've a boy of 6 under my roof who stood next to the pox on Sunday, and I've 3 more little ones besides. And a wife, and I've come to ask you to do the thing I wouldn't let you do a week ago. And I know what I am, coming now. And here is where it turned, though not the way a story turns. Honora did not say you should have come Tuesday. She got her cloak and her lantern and her lancet, and she went up to the fold with the old man half running to keep up, and she vaccinated the 6-year-old first, and then the 3 little ones, and the wife, and the daughter's husband, and the 2 farm boys who slept in the loft, the whole household in 1 hour by the fire, and she prayed over the 6-year-old's arm the only prayer she knew that was any use, which was let it take. Let it take. Because he had stood next to the true pox on Sunday, and this was Thursday, and it was going to be very close. And it was very close. The boy sickened on the 24th, but he sickened with a sore arm and one bad day, and a scatter of pox that dried and fell and left him whole, which is the cowpox, and not its terrible cousin. And Honora sat up 2 nights at the fold to be sure of it, because until the fever broke she could not have sworn before God which pox had got there first, and neither could Eli Broadmead, who did not go to bed either, and who said to her across the child's cot at 3 in the morning the thing that went round 3 parishes by the end of the week. "I've kept sheep 60 year," he said, "and I know a healthy beast from a sick one better than any man on this down. And I looked at you and saw a sick idea, and I was wrong. And if that boy lives, it's because a woman I mocked in a doorway came up my hill at a run and never once threw it in my teeth. That's mine to carry, and I'll carry it out loud, in the bell. So every man that laughed with me hears me do it." That is a thing worth remembering about that whole hard winter. The first man to say she was right, and to say it in public, was a man who had laughed at her to her face. The soldier at the pest hut, God be thanked, was the only case of the true smallpox that Netherwend ever had that winter, because the ring held. He recovered, slowly, and walked on to Dorset in February, with money in his pocket that a duke had given him, and no notion he had been the hinge the whole parish turned on, and the ring held because a girl with a milkmaid's wrist had shut 40 doors in 2 days while a famous man sat safe in Hanover Square. But you should understand what it cost her, because it was not only sleep. By the 3rd week of January there was another thing going round the down besides the pox, and it was this, that the Duke of Aldermere had been seen, more than once, at the apothecary's shop after dark, alone, that he had rolled up his sleeve in his own kitchen for the druggist's daughter, that he had given her his purse to spend as she liked, that a man 2 years a widower, who had not so much as dined out since the Duchess died, was suddenly very much taken up with a young woman who lived alone at the end of the village, and it was not said unkindly, and that was the worst of it, because unkindness you can answer. Mrs. Pardew, the steward's wife, said warmly that it was quite a romance. A subscriber's cousin said, warmly, that Meridew's girl had feathered her nest very prettily out of the pox. And on the last Sunday in January in the church porch, in front of 11 people, a farmer's wife who had known Honora's mother for 30 years turned her shoulder and asked the woman beside her, in a carrying voice, whether it was true the druggist's daughter was giving private lessons up at the great house. Honora went in and sat down and sang the psalm. But she sat there doing an arithmetic she had been avoiding for a fortnight, and it came out cruel, that if the parish decided this was a love story, then it would not be a story about a book. Every case her father ever wrote down, every night she had sat up at a fever, every door she had shut in the pox's face in the dark, would become a joke about a pretty apothecary and a lonely duke, and the joke would outlive the winter and the pox and both of them. And the next time some woman in this parish knew a true thing that the men in the good coats did not, the room would already know what to make of her. That is what the talk cost. And Honora Meridew paid it in full and never sent anybody the bill. It is also why, on the 2nd of February, standing in her own snow-lit garden with a duke's hat turning over in a duke's bare hands, she did not, that night, say yes. But there was the vestry to get through first, and this is where you learn that being right is not the same as winning, which she had known since she was a girl, and had let herself forget for one warm hour in December. Because Dr. Josiah Kellow, honest as he was still engaged to the Duke, and the Duke, converted as he was, had told the whole parish in December to trust Hanover Square. And there were men on the vestry who had liked being promised a famous doctor, and did not care to be told, by a woman, that the famous doctor had been sent home in favor of a milkmaid's wrist. So the vestry met again on the 2nd of February, Candlemas, in the same room with the same damp hassocks and the same smell of tallow, to settle the parish accounts of that terrible month, and to decide formally, on the record, what should be done for the fair now 9 days off. And it was very nearly lost. Sir Roland Chaffee, in the chair, was courteous to her for 40 minutes, and courtesy is not agreement. She laid the daybook on the table and the burial copy beside it and the tally of every soul she had vaccinated, and men leaned in, and one of them asked her a question so sharp that she answered it for 6 minutes without stopping to breathe. And then a subscriber named Hollis stood up and said, reasonably, that it was all very well, but that they had the word of one young woman for the whole of it, one druggist's daughter, and that the College of Physicians surely knew more of the pox than Netherwen did, and that he, for one, would sooner trust the doctor the Duke had engaged than the girl the Duke had, and he did not finish the sentence, but he let it hang, and the room heard the end of it he did not say, and Honora felt the winter tilt. And then 2 things happened close together. The first was that Mr. Ambrose Sedgwick, the vestry clerk, who had said not one word all afternoon, and who had kept the parish burial register in his own hand for 22 years, and who had, 2 winters ago, quietly copied out 1 page of it for a dying apothecary and never asked why, Mr. Sedgwick stood up at his own little table and asked leave to read from the register. And Sir Roland, surprised, gave it. And the clerk read out, in the flat voice of a man reading a list, the burials of the winter of 1808, the laundry maid on the 28th of November, the 2 children in the first week of December, the 4 in the second week, her Grace on the 23rd, and 11 more into January, 19 souls in all. And then he closed that book and opened the day book, which Honora had left on the table, to the page for the 4th of November, and he read the 11 names inoculated at the great house, and the dates, and he set the 2 together in front of the room, the arming and the dying, cause and effect, 19 days apart, in 2 different hands, neither of which was Honora's. And he said, I have kept this register 22 years, and I never once laid it against the doctor's book until this young woman's father asked me to, on his deathbed, and I did it and did not look. And I am ashamed to say I did not look, because if I had looked, I should have seen in 1808 what I see now, which is that we did this to ourselves the last time, with the very method some of you are sorry we have given up. The girl is right. The dates are the dates. I'd have it written down that the clerk said so. The room did not laugh this time. And the second thing was that the door opened and Dr. Josiah Kello came in out of the snow, having ridden 11 miles from Salterton on purpose, stout and gray-whiskered and gold-spectacled and steaming in the cold, and he did not sit down, and he addressed the chair. Sir Roland, he said, I am the college man this parish engaged, and I have come a long way in bad weather to say a short thing, and then I will go. I read Miss Meridew's letter in December, and I answered it by going home, which is not a thing a fashionable physician does lightly, and I did it because she was right, and I knew she was right the moment I read her figures, and I have spent 30 years doing an operation that this young woman's father understood better than I did. In Upper Wend, 4 miles from where you sit, they would not send me home. They inoculated in the old way 3 weeks ago, against my advice, because a magistrate there fancied the old way, and I rode through Upper Wend this morning, and they have buried 2, and they have 9 more down, and their fair will not be held. You held yours the safe way, on the word of a woman you have known since she was a child, and you will bury nobody. And you have the nerve to sit here and weigh her word against my coat. Weigh Upper Wend against it instead. That is all I came to say." And he made the chair a small, stiff bow, and went out into the snow to ride the 11 miles back, and Honora Meridew thought better of him for the rest of her life. Sir Roland Chaffee looked down the table at her. 40 men looked with him. "Miss Meridew," he said, "the parish is in your debt, and does not know how to say so. Is there anything you would have of us?" She had thought about that. She had thought about it on the cold ride back from Cold Harbor and at 2 in the morning at Eli Broadmead's fire, and she did not ask for money. Though the Duke, at the end of the table, had already sent Sir Roland a folded note offering it, which she saw and shook her head at before it was read. She stood up, and she did not hold the book against her chest this time. She laid her hand flat on it. On the table, open. 3 things, she said, and none of them for me. That the parish keep the book. Not this one is my father's and it stays in my hands, but a book, a public register of every inoculation and every case, kept by the clerk and laid before this vestry every Candlemas, so that the next time the pox comes up the London road, Netherwend will not have to take one frightened woman's word for anything, because it will have 30 years of its own. That the vaccination be offered free to every child born in this parish at the font, the same day it is christened, at the estate's charge. For as long as there is a duke at Aldermere to pay for it, and his grace may tell me now, in front of you all, whether he will stand to that, because I'll not have it be a kindness that dies when the winter's forgotten. And the third, she said, and here her voice was not quite level, that Dr. Kellow's name go in the book as the man who was honest enough to go home. Because a college man who says out loud in a cold room that the druggist's daughter was right is worth more to the next frightened parish than any famous man who was never wrong in his life, and I'll not have him remembered only as the doctor who lost the fee. The Duke stood up. He did it slowly, at the end of the table, and every head turned, and he said, "The estate will stand to the second, for as long as there is an Aldermere, and I will put my hand to it before I leave this room. And I will add a fourth, if Miss Meridew permits, since she has been too proud to ask anything for herself, that the office of parish inoculator be made real, and paid, £11 a year as the sexton is paid, and held by whoever this vestry judges knows the most of the pox, which is to say, held by her, and after her by whoever she trains, so that this parish is never again 11 days and one milkmaid's wrist away from a graveyard." It was written down, all of it, in the clerk's hand, that same afternoon, with the light going blue in the tall windows, and signed. And the fair was held 9 days later on the down with 400 strangers on it and not one case of the smallpox in Netherwend, while 4 miles off Upper Wend kept its blinds down and buried its fourth. So, the snow. At about 8 that evening, after the vestry had emptied and the accounts were locked away, the Duke of Aldermere walked the half-mile down to the end of the village, because the groom said the lane was too deep for the horse. And he came to the Physic garden where Honora was breaking the ice on the water butt with the back of a trowel, because a garden does not stop wanting water, because a woman has had a long day. And he stood at her gate in the snow with his hat in his bare hands and the flakes settling in his black hair, and he asked her for 2 things. The first was the book. He asked whether she would let the clerk copy her father's day book, the whole 30 years of it, into the new public register, so that the parish's memory would begin not next Candlemas, but in 1779, and Netherwend would own its own past instead of forgetting it every generation and paying for the forgetting in graves. He asked it formally and awkwardly, as though she might say no. "Yes," she said. "Of course. Come in out of the snow." And then he did not come in out of the snow. He stood at her gate with his ruined hat turning over in his bare red hands, 31 years old, a duke, snow to his ankles, and he said, "In December I sat in a warm room and told these people to leave physic to the college men, and I said it to put you back in your chair. And it worked, and I have thought about it every day since. You had the truth in your arms in that room, and it lost. Because I made it lose. Because I would rather have been comfortable than corrected in front of my own tenants. And then you came up my hill, not literally. I came down yours, but you came up a harder one. You took the worst thing that ever happened to me, the death I have blamed on God for 2 years, and you handed it back to me as a thing that was done by men and could have been prevented by men, which is either the cruelest thing anyone has ever done to me or the kindest, and I have decided it is the kindest. Because a grief you can prevent next time is worth more than a grief you can only weep at." He turned the hat over. "That is the first thing I came to say, and it is an apology, and I know it is the wrong size, and I have brought it anyway. The second thing is that I am asking you to marry me, and I am entirely aware of how it looks. Tonight, at this gate, in this snow, 9 days after you saved my son's parish and 2 years after another woman stood where I am asking you to stand. And I would rather ask you badly tonight and have the whole down say what it likes than ask you beautifully next year when you have already decided what I am. So I am asking now, and you may take as long as the candles last." She did not answer him at once. She set the trowel down on the frozen butt, and she looked at him for a while, and then she said the truest thing she had, which was, "There are people in this parish who will say I nursed my way into a title, and they will say it about my father's book and my mother's name and every night I sat up this month, and they will say it for the rest of my life. And I have spent this whole winter deciding I did not care, and I find at your gate that I still do not care, but I want you to know I have counted the cost before I answer, because I will not have you think I did not see it." "I saw you count it," said the Duke, "on the last Sunday in January, in the church porch, when that woman turned her shoulder to you. I was 3 pews back. You sang the psalm. I have wanted to marry you since about the 2nd verse. And Honora Meridew, 24, apothecary's daughter, standing in her own snow among the dead stalks of the Physic garden her father had planted, found that the thing she had thought she would have to weigh for a week weighed nothing at all when it was actually in her hand, and she said, 'Then come in out of the snow, your grace, before you take a chill, and I'll want the second thing written down like all the rest, because a thing said once is only a rumor.' They were married in April in the church with the register in it, in a cold, bright spring, and the whole of Nether Wend came, and Upper Wend too, what was left of it. And Eli Broadmead gave her away because she had no father to do it, and he said it was the least a man could do who'd called her a fraud in her own doorway. Dr. Josiah Kello came down from London for it, and sat at the front and wept without shame. And every year for the rest of his life he wrote to the Duchess of Aldermere at Candlemas for her tally of the parish, and printed it entire. When he read a paper to the college on the vaccination 3 years later, with Nathaniel Meridew's name and his daughter's at the head of the table, and his own underneath, and neither of them ever mentioned Hanover Square again. Mr. Ambrose Sedgwick kept the public register in his own hand until he died, and copied the whole 30 years of the day book into the front of it as she had asked. And where the 2 hands met on the page, the dead apothecaries and the living clerks, he ruled a line and wrote a note that is still there, and that you may go and read, which says only, the parish begins its memory here and asks that it never again forget what this book cost to fill. And the vaccination was given free at the font the same day as the water to every child christened in that parish, for as long as there was an aldermere to pay for it. And there was an aldermere to pay for it for a very long time, because the first child so armed, that same spring, in the same cold font, with the whole village watching, was the Duke's own son. And Honora did it herself, with her own hand, cowpox into a small ducal arm. And the boy cried at the water and not at the lancet, and grew up whole in a house where the pox never came again. She was a duchess for 39 years, and she read the parish register every Candlemas for every one of them, and stood up in that vestry whether they wanted to hear the numbers or not. And after her, her eldest daughter, who trained under her and held the £11 a year and the office of it, read them. And after her, another, it is being read still. I keep thinking about that first vestry in December, the warm room, the soft laugh, and a young woman with a dead man's book against her chest who had to sit back down while 40 men agreed to do a kind and deadly thing at their landlord's expense, because that is where it ends for nearly everybody, isn't it? She had the truth in her arms in that room, and the truth lost. And it did not begin to win until a duke came down her lane in the dark, and a milkmaid grew a sore on her wrist, and an old shepherd took his hat off in a doorway. So tell me which one you would have been in that room. The one who stands up when the whole vestry is already laughing and says the true thing anyway, or the one who goes home and keeps the book that makes them listen in the end. Both of them are in this story, and they are the same woman, and only one of them was ever thanked for it. Next time, I'll tell you about a woman who was sent, in her own dead mother's hand, a letter that had been kept back for 20 years. And I would dearly love to know where you are listening from tonight, so leave the name of your town in the comments, and I will read them out. A low flint shop at the end of a snowbound village. A candle in the window, a book on the counter open at a line nobody wanted read, and no sound at all but the ice ticking on the butt in the dark.